there's no such thing as retirement. Another person won't find particularly objectionable. And it's in your head whether it's for leisure or work. So no problem between leisure and work, and no retirement. Stop at that point. I just showed my granddaughter, one of my granddaughters, my notes before I came out, and she expressed a view that starting as I was proposing to do in 35,000 BC was a bit early. So I may skip the earlier part of my remarks, but they're in text is here, if you need it. Yeah, keep you happy. I'd start with just a brief reference to benefits of membership, which you know about, but there are three main areas. When we joined, agriculture was still a very important part of our economy. 25% of the population at that time was still in agriculture, and most people saw the EU as the positive side, as getting the benefit of getting out from under the British cheap food policy. Britain in 1846, in order to secure the continued advantage of the Industrial Revolution, where they were first, decided to allow food in from all over the world to keep wages down. And that sustained Britain to about 1890, after which the fact that they had concentrated on cheap food and low wages ran against them, and British productivity didn't keep up with the rest of Europe, and for 80 years thereafter, Britain lost ground vis-à-vis the rest of Europe. We got out from under Britain politically, but not economically. All our trade was Britain, which was the slowest growing country in Europe, and also our farmers were exploited by virtue of the cheap food policy. So most people saw membership as particularly beneficial in that area, and it was, and proved to be so. There was also talk of structural funds at the time. There was a social fund when we joined, a regional fund about to be established, and it was felt that would help us also. And these were both important. CAP, particularly for the first 20 years or so, with agriculture still an important part of our economy, benefited hugely with the doubling of prices overnight and further increases thereafter. And the structural funds helped us to deal with some of the backlog in our infrastructure, because we had been, of course, a very poor country by your Northern European standards, with about a GNP 50 to 60% of the rest of Europe at that time, and therefore, we managed to increase our income per head very rapidly in the 90s and catch up and pass out other countries. You can do that with income. You don't do it with infrastructure. It takes decades to catch up, and we were greatly helped by the structural funds. But in fact, the really important thing, which nobody fully understood, I won't claim myself to have had such prescience, was on the industrial side. Everybody saw industry as the problem. Indeed, I left working at Aer Lingus in 1958 after the EU was established in order to get to a point where I could assist development of Irish industry, which was totally inefficient, huge protection barriers, 100% tariffs, nil quotas was coming in, extraordinarily inefficient, incompetent, could export nothing. And the problem was, I feared we wouldn't be able to get in and get the benefits on the agricultural side because our industry would be wiped out. Therefore, I decided to go for that. And for the 1960s, I was, in fact, consultant with the Federation of Industries. But in fact, it turned out the other way around. It is true. Of the 150,000 jobs in industry, 50,000 disappeared, though not very quickly, mostly in the 1980s, when there was a recession anyway, rather than quickly and immediately after we joined. But those jobs were lost. But we got twice as many better jobs, better paid, in foreign industries establishing here. And the result was that we had agricultural prosperity in the 70s, helping us through the transitional period into the 80s. And then we had the inflow of foreign industry replacing, and it means twice as many jobs at better pay than we had previously. They're the benefits of membership, but really nobody foresaw the latter. We all saw the industrial side as being the danger area. It turned out to be the area of huge prosperity. So you never really think these things through. It's hard to foresee the future. So the future may look rather black at the moment. It's probably going to be quite good sometime in the future. But we can't know. I want, having said that much on the economic side, to start by saying that Europe has a particular value system which has been developed in the European Union in response to certain European instincts. Now, in the Lisbon Treaty, there's talk about democracy and liberty and all the rest of it. That's grand. All the values we share with the United States. What it doesn't do, I regret, and by the time I got around to suggesting it was too late, they already had decided to list these common values of the democratic states. We have our own particular values, which are quite different from the United States. In fact, none of them are shared in the United States, and they should be highlighted, but they weren't. The first of these, take them in more or less chronological order, immediately after this I get to Lisbon, is the decision after the war to establish the supranational human rights regime at Strasbourg, with countries ceding their sovereignty in relation to the rights of their own citizens, giving the citizens a right to appeal to an outside body vis-à-vis their own government and their own judiciary if human rights were affected. That was an extraordinary thing to do in 1950. Other proposals at that time to move towards a much more structured Europe didn't get anywhere, but that particular change was hugely important. Arising from that, later, by 1972 certainly, all states abolished capital punishment. And of course that still exists in many parts of the United States. No country could now join the European Union if it had capital punishment. So our value system in respect of external monitoring of human rights and capital punishment diverges markedly from the United States. Next, commitment to international law. People often don't notice this distinction, but the United States does not actually accept international law in the same way we do. They mined ports in Nicaragua in the 80s and refused to accept the World Court decision in regard to that. Whereas in Europe, after the war, because of the reaction to the war, there was a general commitment to international law. Now, I'm not saying that states are perfect, and occasionally they try and get around international law or dodge it in some way, but they are publicly committed to it. And that value system is important in international relations. Then, of course, the establishment of the European Economic Community, its motivation was to prevent war between France and Germany ever occurring again. What people didn't realize at the time was in doing that, in establishing a zone of peace in the area of 6 countries, then 9, 10, and later 15. In doing that, the commitment became a commitment to a zone of peace which spread. So when Eastern Europe opened up in 1989, although there were terrible problems in Yugoslavia, Albania, in the Western Balkans, in the rest of Eastern Europe, the conflicts that had torn them apart right through the 20th century didn't re-emerge. The Hungarians and Romanians who'd been quarreling about Transylvania and handing it backwards and forwards after various wars didn't get into a rouse again, because they recognized if they started fighting over that, they'd never get into the EU or into NATO, which they were concerned with. So that the result was the zone of peace we'd established within Western Europe spread to the rest of Europe, except for the Western Balkans. That was very important. The other thing that happened, of course, in the 60s on was not just the disappearance of colonization, but the replacement of colonization, in which an important element was exploitation of the poorer third world by the richer first world, replacing it by a system of transfer of resources by aid. Instead of money taken from the poor to feed the rich, that was reversed around into the rich helping the poor. Now, you make a lot of criticisms of aid. Some of it has elements of self-interest. Some countries give aid only if you buy our products, if you take our products. We haven't done that in Ireland. So we have a good record in that area. But the point is the reversal of history there. And these are all reversals of history, conscious reversals of history. Going the opposite of what was the case up to the middle of the 20th century. And aid replacing colonization, reversing the flow of resources, however imperfect it may be in some respects, is an extraordinary thing to have happened. Then Europe is responsible for the global ecological movement. By the way, our aid is about half the aid in the world comes from Europe. The United States aid is very limited, apart from aid to Israel. All other aid until recently was in fact a military aid, although they are now providing assistance in regard to AIDS, somewhat different, on quite a substantial scale. But the whole aid process has been primarily European and not followed much, except for military reasons, by Russia or by the United States. Global ecology then. It was in Europe that the first recognition emerged of the dangers to our planet through global warming, and we have led on that always in Europe. So part of our value system. Again, the United States until Obama did not show any commitment to it, nor the Russians, nor greatly for a while the Japanese. So it's a European value. And finally, of course, some years ago, it was decided to establish an international criminal court to deal with cases of major breaches of human rights. That was resisted by the states, couldn't accept it. They even thought to have given substantial aid to Romania if Romania would also oppose it and not join. So you have a whole series there of European values, quite distinct from, opposite to, and not followed by the United States. They're not attacking the United States, which means the point that Europe is different. We have our own values, and under Obama, you see the already seeing in regard to global ecology, certainly, and probably in other areas, America moving closer to our position. That would be an excellent thing. So much then for that, because I think it's important that we know what Europe is for. And I don't think people enunciate these values sufficiently clearly. I've been trying to do so the last 20 years to get across to people. Right. Then Lisbon. Come to Lisbon itself. The need for we've had a number of treaties, of course, previously. We've had the Single European Act. I said when we joined, nobody envisaged there'd be another treaty. We assumed that was it. And in fact, in the Dáil here, when it was going through the referendum in 1972, the party I was involved with, and I played an active part in it, reacted very positively to the European Union, very positive. But we were fearful, because oppositions are always paranoid about the government, whoever they are, that we feared that the government might in some way try to get around the Dáil by using Europe as a way to enact things the Dáil wouldn't enact. And that was not anti-European, it was just anti-Fianna Fáil. And in that paranoia, we tied down the arrangements for the referendum very tightly by saying that if there's any question of any further change in sovereignty, there should be a referendum, another referendum. We didn't think it would happen. We didn't think there would be more treaties and more referendums at all. And then the Single European Act was important because the French in 1965 blocked the actual creation of the single market. Lots of things happened up to that point. You had the freedom of trade, yes, externally, but not the creation of a single market. And for 20 years after that, the single market was stuck. Other things happened, the community enlarged, European Parliament became elected directly, a lot of things happened, but not the actual creation of a single market, which is what the whole thing was going to be about at the beginning. And it was only in 1984, 3 presidents later, that President Mitterrand and Fontainebleau at his last European Council meeting proposed that I would set up a group of representatives. We followed the French in the presidency, of representative heads of government to look at this whole question and to get out from under the blockage of de Gaulle. And I appointed a foreign minister I had a year or two earlier, Jim Doug, a very distinguished scientist, to head that. And out of that came a report, which went eventually to the European Council in June of 1980. Oh God, which year was that? 86, was it? No, I'll go back a bit. 85 it was, yeah. And there was agreement there. Margaret Thatcher had been told it wouldn't be pushed at that meeting, not to worry about it. Before the meeting, the Italians persuaded the French and Germans to change their mind and to push for it. So at 11 o'clock that day, they announced they were calling an intergovernmental conference, which only requires a simple majority. It's procedural. She was actually furious. There was a break in the meeting, and she warned me not to support this. We had interest in Northern Ireland. We had a crucial meeting in Northern Ireland that morning at 8 o'clock, and I mustn't back this. And I voted with the original 6, and she got the Greeks and then Danes to vote with her against. Of course, subsequently she claimed she was the author of the Single European Act. And the tame British press gave her all the credit for that. The British actually believed that she was responsible for it, and she did her best to oppose it. But in any event, it was very important from our point of view because the single market was hugely important to us. We'd done well in the community, certainly, on the industrial side. We got a fair amount of foreign investment. But the real benefits could only accrue if we got a genuine single market. It was great to get to that stage. It took a few years, and having agreement that decisions toward the single market should be by qualified majority, couldn't be blocked by anybody with a veto, and it got it through by 1992. And that, of course, is what was crucially responsible for our extraordinary growth in the 1990s, 8 or 9% per annum growth, doubling our GNP within 8 or 9 years. So it was very important to us. But we had, when it came to putting it through, we put it to the Dáil, and it was challenged by a particular gentleman, and the Supreme Court, very oddly actually, decided that it required a referendum. The reason was odd because you could have argued that some of the economic changes involved affect our sovereignty. You couldn't really rationally argue that the political side did, and yet the Supreme Court, with a particular judge pushing things along, with 3 votes to 2, decided that because it had a provision for foreign policy, in which we had a veto, that affected our sovereignty. And then I could see how your sovereignty would be affected if you had a veto, anything happening. As a result, we required a referendum. And since then, every new treaty, and there are a whole string of different treaties, which we never expected to have, every treaty has involved referendum, because no government wants, once again, to try to get it through the door, have it challenged and find they're shot down by the courts. I don't think the courts would do it again, but governments are fearful of that. So we've ended up having referendums, some of which probably were unnecessary, but it has the advantage, of course, that our people are better informed after referendum than other peoples are who don't have referendums. And up to fairly recently, we got them all through. Unfortunately, until Nice 1 went wrong. And there was Amsterdam, the tidying up treaty didn't do very much. It was actually drafted by us at the time, the text of it. Maastricht, very important, was prepared for the euro. And then first Nice, which we didn't get through. Second Nice, we got through. First Lisbon didn't get through. Second Lisbon, hopefully we get through. All these treaties we've had. So there was a whole process which none of us originally expected to happen. Anyway, with the increase in membership, for a variety of reasons, we felt that we should look again at where we'd got to, where we ought to be. A number of different factors emerged here. One was the practical problem of getting decisions through with a whole lot of unanimity requirement. 27 countries, it's different enough. I remember when 6 became 9, and we were there, we had difficulty getting decisions. I said you shouldn't let us in before you sorted out your decision making. Because 9 of us is too many to get anything through. 27 was virtually impossible. So the feeling was a need to change the system and make it a bit easier and to limit the areas where there were vetoes. It was also a concern because in some ways the system was not all that democratic, and it was concerned to make it more democratic. One way or the other, there was a feeling that we should look again. And so at Laeken in Belgium, it was decided to identify changes that would be needed or be useful to cope with enlargement and fill gaps and remedy weaknesses in the earlier treaties. To do that, convention in Brussels was called. A really extraordinary event, without precedent anywhere in the world, because it wasn't just governments got together. Governments, oppositions got together with the European Parliament, European Commission, in order to decide what changes were needed. There's no precedent anywhere else for that kind of totally democratic approach of bringing everybody together. And we had a disproportionate role to play, by chance, to some degree. First of all, John Bruton, who had been our teacher before, was a member of the Presidium. Now, it was organized with President Giscard d'Estaing presiding and 2 other very well-known Europeans helping him. And he was very clear what he wanted and tried to push everything through, and was quite ruthless about it. And the person who challenged him most was John Bruton, who even, when it was necessary, not just in the Presidium, but the plenary session, pointed out he wasn't quite telling the truth in one particular matter. So, you know, the greatest challenge to the bossiness of Giscard d'Estaing came from Ireland. Secondly, our Minister of State, Dick Roche, organised 16 smaller countries to come together, meet every week, and stand up to the pressures of the larger countries. And the whole leadership came from us on that. It was very effective. And we held our ground as a result. The delegation of the European Parliament was led by its president, who happened to be Pat Cox. The delegation of the European Commission was led by its Secretary General, who happened to be David O'Sullivan. So, one way or another, we had an extraordinary role in this event. And no treaty anywhere has ever been quite as Irish as this one as a result, because we also had our civil servants and foreign affairs trying to ensure that certain things didn't get through. There were problems. Altogether, the treaty that came out at the end was precisely what we looked for. It wasn't what the Irish people decided they wanted, of course, when it came to the referendum. It's not a day's work. What we were concerned about negatively were to maintain our unanimous decision-making on three things: on direct taxation, so the corporate tax rate, our low rate, which we moved towards gradually from 1958 onwards. Basically, we, unlike other countries, basically saw that the taxing industry, as distinct from taxing people, is not a great way to achieve economic growth. And so from 58 onwards through export tax relief, one kind and another, which we had to modify, but you can't discriminate in the community between exports and home production. That whole system, sorry, my mind goes blank sometimes. Has led to a situation where we've ended up with a much lower corporate tax rate in other countries, which is beneficial for growth and in itself beneficial. And of course, when you compare to other countries, it means people may come and locate here because it is lower than elsewhere. We managed to get that to ensure that our veto on any change in that remained. We have our protection of military neutrality, is built into the treaty, we have a particular phrase, and neutrality, taxation, and what's the other one? Yeah, well, defence, yeah. But that's neutrality. A third one, which No. I'll come back to them anyway, there are. But the three things we needed to maintain veto on, we held. So we also, in the discussions, we also secured incorporation of social provisions in the treaty, in spite of the British a lot. And that was just Rossa was very strong on that, Labour Party. And we also ensured equality in relation to membership of the Commission. The proposal was the Commission would be reduced in numbers. That's gone by the board now as part of the concessions to us to help us to get the Lisbon Treaty through. But we ensured that insofar as there was a reduction, it would be so total equality regardless of size of countries. So we had done a successful convention. I have to say that on the whole, over our whole period in Europe, we have been successful. We had 6 presidencies, with 6 different Taoiseach, 3 from each party, the 2 main parties, and every one of them was successful. Luck as well as skill, because you can't have a successful presidency unless there's some major issue to be settled, and you settle it. There's nothing much to settle. You can't be successful particularly. But luckily, first one I had as Foreign Minister, a whole lot of issues came up, but subsequently, which we got through, there was always something. The next one was Charlie Haughey, German reunification, and he called 2 European councils to get it past Margaret Thatcher, and succeeded. And there was Jack Lynch before that. Jack Lynch, yes, he had one which had to deal with the British, special concession to Britain about its payments they had to make. And that was got through. I don't think we had much to do with it, but we got the credit for it, though. We handled it well, but I think there's some... I finally met in Dublin for the European Council. It was pretty well prearranged at that stage. Then we had one for the Spaniards and Portuguese joining, and there was a problem because Italians and French didn't want Spanish wine getting in, and I had to sort that one out, and that was done successfully. with Amsterdam, got that through. And then we had Bertie Ahern, great success in getting the original version of this agreed when the Italians had failed to do so. So every presidency has been successful, and that, of course, was down to our credit very much. So much for that. Now, let's now look at the main things in the treaty. One thing it does is deal with values. Now, the words here, you can argue, are just words, but they're not, because if you get the right words in, it is an inhibition to people trying to do bad things. And in the Lisbon Treaty, there are provisions which are not in the earlier version, place great emphasis on values. It says the Union is founded on values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of minorities. That's new. It shall combat social exclusion and discrimination and promote social justice and protection, equality between women and men, that was there before. Solidarity between generations, whatever that means, not borrowing too much money and leaving you people to pay for it later on, I suppose. And protection of the rights of the child. It shall respect Europe's rich linguistic and cultural diversity, ensure that Europe's cultural heritage is safeguarded and enhanced, because there's always a fear that it'll all be kind of globalized, Europeanized, and we'd lose the diversity, which is such an extraordinary mark of Europe. And then, in relations to the wider world, shall contribute to peace, security, and the well-being of its peoples, sustainable development of the earth, solidarity and respect amongst peoples, eradication of poverty, protection of human rights, in particular the rights of the child, as well as a strict observance of international law, including the principles of the United Nations, which were not previously mentioned. So, all these things which had not been specified there before were implicit, they've been made explicit. And to that extent, the treaty is better than what lay before, was there before. It also involves accession by the whole community to the Convention of Human Rights, not just member states, the community itself, and its own Charter of Human Rights designed to ensure that in its legislation, the European Union would not do anything impinging on human rights. And its own Charter inhibits, it doesn't affect individual states, but it does affect the capacity of the Union to do anything that might damage human rights. So that aspect was important. Then there are areas where people had worries. I don't think people were clear that the Union can only do that which member states have all agreed it can do. So there's a clear statement now, which wasn't there before, but conferral. Union can only act where competences are conferred by states. All competences not conferred remain with states. That's made explicit. It was implicit before. It was made explicit, and some people needed that kind of reassurance. Subsidiarity, that was mentioned to some degree before, but outside of the area where the community has exclusive competence, we've given it competence to act, rather than states being involved. Outside of that area, it can only act if the scale or effects of its actions are better achieved at union level than it could be achieved at state level. Proportionality. EU action shall not exceed what is necessary to achieve objectives of the treaties. So the various constraints and limitations are made more explicit. Also, the right to withdraw, which was not there before, and it is now a right to withdraw, if you want to withdraw. Some talk to Greenland might withdraw. Nobody else seems inclined to do so at the moment. There's also an interesting provision about relations with churches and religious bodies. The Union respects and does not prejudice the status under national law of churches and religious associations or communities, and shall maintain an open, transparent, and regular dialogue with them. That's a new element as well. Another point which worried some people was about public services. Would the provisions of competition and so on mean that things like the health service will be privatised, things like that? Well, it's maybe privatised, and governments may do that, and some of them are doing it at the moment, including our own to a degree. But the community has no role regard to that. All public services, decisions whether they remain public services or privatised is a matter for the state, not for the Union. Treaties do not affect in any way the competence of member states to provide, commission and organise non-economic services of general interest, public services. That reassurance was sought, and it's important to have it because certainly people were worried about it, and you could see how the competition policy might lead towards privatisation. But that's not something the state to do, not for other people. Other concerns were about the fact that the system is not as democratic as it might be, or seemed not to be. One initiative here, I don't think it's likely to matter very much, but it might, is the power of initiative. 1 million people from a significant number of member states can invite the Commission to make a proposal, for pressure on the Commission to act in an area where it hasn't acted. How many number of states? No, that's a matter of the European Parliament will decide in due course. But it does indicate at least a willingness to be open to public opinion. Again, the Council of Ministers has always acted met in private. It doesn't mean people know what's happening. In fact, it always leaks out and always goes out and briefs immediately. And if you have 9 or even 27 countries busy briefing, it's unlikely anything will remain secret under those circumstances. It is actually a very open system, as I found in dealing with the Commission. The contrast between the Commission and its openness and our national civil services is very striking. I brought 40 years ago a number of my Econ SC class of economists there, and there were 8 of them, each were doing a different thesis. Brought them into the offices, and everywhere the official would say, "Oh, I've got here's the documents here, and all kinds of secret documents immediately produced, anybody wants them." You wouldn't get that in our own domestic civil service, I can tell you. But anyway, the decision now that the Council will legislate in public. Now, of course, there will be private discussions beforehand, but the decision-making and who votes for what will in future be in public, and rather than having to be leaked out afterwards. And some people thought that was important. Quite a lot of provisions about national parliaments, recognition that national parliaments should play a bigger role. Some do, some don't. We've been pretty ineffective in that area. Governments have tended to want to handle these things themselves and not have these damn parliamentarians interfering, as governments are inclined to do. Now the provision is made that all draft legislation in the EU must be sent 8 weeks before we put to the Council, to national parliaments, with details of the rules that would need to be put in place if this legislation goes through by the nation state. And parliaments then have to be kept informed, and they can then send in their representations. And if they think that legislation is interfering with subsidiarity, it's doing things that would be better done in their own state rather than by Europe, they can make representations accordingly. And they can send a reasoned opinion on that issue to the Council, the European Parliament and the Commission. Either House can send such a reasoned opinion, and account shall be taken of these reasoned opinions. It's not binding, but I mean, if a number of parliaments are complaining this legislation goes beyond what's needed, they wouldn't likely get very far after that, because they'd have to think twice about it. And if 1/3 of national parliament's votes involved, a draft has to be reviewed. And it's a veto if 55% of states or majority of the European Parliament are against legislation. Moreover, interesting, and here's a quite striking thing. If there's a proposal to change decision-making from a veto to qualified majority, and even if all the governments agree to that, they're willing to go along with it, either house of any parliament can veto it. Our Senate, not a body of got it very highly, wrongly, it's not a bad body at all, I was in it myself for a period. The Senate could have a vote and decide and block the whole thing, which is a remarkable provision, which ensures that governments can't give away a veto if one house of the parliament doesn't want that to happen. So you see there's quite a number of things there which make the whole thing more democratic. Now, I don't know how much more I want to go on about things, but I mean, the other areas which, the common foreign security policy, I should say something about that and probably leave it there. And you can ask questions then or raise issues you want to raise. What's not understood about this is there can't be a common foreign policy. There isn't a single common foreign policy. A common foreign policy emerges if all states agree on a particular issue what should be done. And there wasn't much of that around at the beginning, I can tell you. When we became members, the Palestinian problem was there, as it has been for half a century. And France and Italy took the view that this was not a refugee problem, it was a problem of creating a state for Palestinians as their own state. I shared that view and joined them. We couldn't get very far because the other 6 states, still very much influenced for historical reasons by the Holocaust, were not prepared to push Israel on the issue, and so we didn't get anywhere with that. But in the years that followed, opinion evolved, and eventually the other 6 came to agree with us 3. And in 1980 in Venice, it was agreed that there should be a Palestinian state. So a common foreign policy happened when everybody agreed with us. And in fact, that is very important because, in fact, there are a very wide range of views in the community. And foreign policy only exists where there is agreement of everybody. In 27 countries, it's not that easy to get agreement. I think there's agreement now on how they should approach Iran and trying to get Iran to not to go too far with their nuclear policy. But it's important to understand that a common foreign policy exists only where everybody agrees. And we have very different views from other countries on many issues. And we retain that independent foreign policy. I was writing about that on Saturday in another context, showing how at the UN we did many things, took on all 5 of the permanent representatives, permanent members, and won out on about 8 issues, helped to stop the war in Angola, and saved Spanish Sahara from the Moroccans by organising things and getting other people to come along with us in some of these issues. So we have an independent foreign policy. Now we may choose how we handle that. And many people will say that we shouldn't have agreed, allowed the American troops to come through Shannon. It's widely held. I don't myself share that view, because when France and Germany, which had opposed the Iraq venture very strongly, when they weren't making a fuss about it, it looked a bit odd if we decided alone in Europe to take a line on this and not let them through. And use it when we never even checked the Russians' planes going through to Cuba. Never searched them. So to turn around and do it to the Americans at that stage would not have been very helpful to our relation to the United States, on whom we depend economically. So a choice was made, having opposed the Iraq war, as we did, and made it clear the resolution 141 did not, or 1141 was, did not in fact authorize the invasion of Iraq, and made that clear in our statement. We decided prudence required that we did not stop American planes going through. I think we could have taken a different view about the planes, CIA planes going through, and from the beginning had an eye on that, which we didn't do. But these are matters of opinion. But I mean, we decide our foreign policy. Occasionally, we will allow our interests, our commercial interests, to influence it. I found in government that the time when Libya was helping the IRA, it was very hard to get the ministers of agriculture, industry and commerce to take a tough line with Libya, because they saw advantages selling cattle and so on to Libya. Every government has internal tensions of that kind. But it's we who decide these issues. We have an independent foreign policy unless everybody agrees with us, in which case there's a common foreign policy. And it's important, I think, to make that clear. Anyway, decisions are by unanimity. If an unanimous decision is taken, the implementation of it may in certain circumstances be done by qualified majority, but that can be blocked by any state. If we have all agreed on a policy and something in the implementation we don't like, it's open to us to say that we have a vital and stated reason for opposing it, in which case to try and sort it out, and if we don't agree, the whole thing is referred to the European Council, which still has decided by unanimity. So there's some softening there, but it still leaves us with a veto. States are required to improve their military capabilities. It doesn't mean spending more money, it doesn't say that at all, there's money in it. And obviously, if we're going to be effective as peacekeepers, we should improve our capabilities. We've been doing that, closing down barracks and trying to reduce the size of the army so that the money can be put into equipping them properly. We've been doing that anyway. So there's been some argument about that, but it seems to me, as we're not required to spend more money, I don't think there's a great problem about it. There is a European Defence Association to try and ensure that the armaments we use in peacekeeping will be compatible with each other, and the telephones can talk to each other and all the rest of it. And we haven't quite decided whether we'll limit our involvement in that or whether we'll accept it in a general way. That's a matter for us to decide. That's about it. I mean, there's other things, there's more and more things, but I mean, I have to sit here all day, all night. I too have other things to do. But, we'll stop there and let you raise any issues you want to raise. I think the most important things, I should mention that there is, of course, in foreign policy to be the High Representative, because at the moment you have the Commission, who does the economic side, and you have Solana, who does the political side, and merging into one system makes sense. And he will have available to him, an external service. So there would be some kind of diplomatic service available to the High Representative. But all his actions depend upon getting agreement on what the foreign policy is to be pursued. But it would be better to have one person and some more coherence and trying to get agreement is rather than the rather incoherent system at present. I should have mentioned that. And of course the European Council, up to now all councils have been, the chairmanship rotates between countries alphabetically, or more or less alphabetically, and that will be changed in that while that will continue for most councils, the High Representative will preside over the Foreign Affairs Council, and the European Council will have somebody presiding over 2.5 years, renewable for 2.5 years, who has to chair it. I have seen some difficulties about that, because if there is a crisis somewhere, will this President of the European Council simply sit and chair it? Or will he wander around the world interfering with the High Representative, what he's trying to do? And I'm not sure the High Representative should preside at the Foreign Affairs Council. It's better to have an independent chairman. These are minor points you can argue either way. Anyway, there we are. Oh, finally the voting. Well, yes, the voting system has changed. What happened was we started with 6 countries, 3 large, 3 small. And then over time, the ratio changed. And then, of course, more and more small countries joined. You ended up with the totally unbalanced thing, which the small countries had far too many votes. And the big countries got a bit irritated having their vote constantly diluted. And they now do have a larger vote than they did have before, but we still have a disproportionate vote. Our share of vote is still disproportionate to our size. Some people think that's bad, but I don't think there is actually a vote. I mean, people have in mind what the vote could be if there were a vote. So the votes are not totally unimportant, but they're rarely actually exercised. So much for that. Sorry. I'll stop now. Over to you.